So, welcome, Jill. She muted. Okay, so we're going to get started then. So I'm here in this here in the office with the London group. So welcome to everybody to this month's conference call. For those of you who are new to results, welcome Brighton. For those of you who are new to results or joining us for the first time, you're particularly welcome. My name's Naveed Chowdhury. I'm head of campaigns here at Results. Welcome also to Norwich. We've got a good selection of people from around the country today. So I'll kick off. As you'll have seen, if you had a chance to read the action materials this month, which were just emailed out last week, you'll know that the topic is global education and replenishment of the Global Partnership for Education, or GPE, which is a key funding body which supports many countries around the world to develop and improve their education systems. I'll say very little about that now because we have an expert speaker who will do that for us, and I'll introduce you later. So as usual, before we get into that topic, I'm just going to do a usual brief roundup of the things that have been going on in the world that are relevant to issues that we work on in Results, and a roundup of the things that you've been doing to help make a difference. So, firstly, most of you will know already that in concert with other international development agencies, we've been particularly keen this year to share with parliamentarians and the public the very, very good work that's done all around the world with UK aid, from things like supporting the efforts to eradicate polio, TB, other diseases of poverty, to helping poor countries develop effective health and education systems they need for a successful future. So whilst we obviously know that international development is about far more than just aid, we know that support from developed countries is, at least for now, a crucial part of helping countries support their own populations in the longer term. Last Monday, we had a bit of good news, which you probably didn't hear about in the media, but it was very important nonetheless. The UK government has been part of international discussions on what counts as overseas aid, or in the technical jargon, official development assistance, or ODA. There's an official definition of what counts as aid spending, so that when countries are reporting on their contributions, we know exactly what is included, what kind of spending. And we're not saying that we're spending money on development when in fact it's going somewhere else. There's been some pressure recently to widen the definition of aid to include military spending, for example, where we're providing military support in a humanitarian crisis, and to count UK financial support to wealthier overseas territories as development assistance, as we saw after the recent Hurricane Irma when it affected UK overseas territories in the Caribbean. We're really pleased actually with the outcome of these discussions, and what happened was that whilst the official definition of ODA was broadened slightly to deal with those concerns, it remains essentially focused on poverty reduction, as it absolutely should be. This is really good news, and we believe that there was a real risk that this focus could have been watered down, or the UK's commitment to spending 0.7% of our national income on aid might have been weakened. The fact that that hasn't happened is in part because our arguments were accepted, but also very much because of the political will that's been generated to support effective UK action to tackle extreme poverty. And your ongoing actions with MPs and the public on the issue that we campaign about every month play a really big part in gaining and sustaining that political will. So do please take your part of the credit for this news. Technical though it is really important. Next, I'd like to mention what happened on World Polio Day, which was the 24th of October. Feels like a long time ago, but it's only a couple of weeks. The One Last Push campaign, of which Results as a member, organised a wheelchair basketball match in Trafalgar Square to highlight the damage caused to children's lives in the few countries where polio still exists in the wild, and the critical importance of ending polio forever. The match was between mixed teams of Paralympians and MPs, and it was a fun way to mark the day. And if you go to the blog section of the Results website, you can read a post by our resident polio expert, Jim Calverley, about why this issue is so important. And there's also a really nice piece of video of live action of the day and some interviews with MPs. So that was a really nice thing. Do go and have a look at it if you get time. The next thing I want to say is I'd like to thank everyone again who took our September action on nutrition. That might feel again a bit of a while ago now, but the Global Nutrition Summit was held in Milan this last Saturday, the 4th of November. Now, a total of 3.4 billion US dollars, believe it or not, was committed to scaling up nutrition efforts, which seems like an enormous sum, and it is. $680 million of that was new money. And that involves a whole load of new donors, including philanthropic organisations and countries from the south as well as the north. So bringing new people into supporting nutrition was really good. Lord Bates, who's a Minister of State for International Development, attended the summit. The UK government did not make any new pledge of financial resources, but it did announce that it's unlocked all the remaining matched funding of £280 million from its 2013 pledge. So what that means essentially is that it would give us that amount of money on condition that other donors would come forward. And as a result of this conference, those donors have come forward and that money is now unlocked. So that's really great. That's a lot of extra money coming on stream, although it's already been pledged. Progress on nutrition is definitely therefore being made. However, we are still off track to meet the internationally agreed nutrition targets. And so obviously our campaigning as results goes on. For more detail, again, you can read a blog post on the results website by Anushri Shiror. She's our expert who's actually attended the summit, and she set out how, thanks in part to your campaigning, nutrition remains one of the UK's highest priorities, as it continues to be accountable for its 2013 pledge, and to keep ensuring, working with other governments to ensure that nutrition doesn't fall off the radar. So this is a message of kind of measured progress, I think, on nutrition. That's a kind of overview of what's going on out there in the world. I'd like to now introduce a new staff member here at Results. She is Hannah McLean-Knight, who has taken over the role of Campaigns Coordinator from Maddie Moore, who many of you will know. We're really happy to welcome Hannah to Results, and tonight she's with the Birmingham group, and you should be able to see her on your screen if you've got your video turned on. Hannah, can I ask you to just introduce yourself to everybody briefly, and then maybe before you, when you've done that, could you give the roundup of the campaigning activity from around the country?
Great, thank you, Naveed. I'm hoping everyone can hear me okay. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for the short introduction. I'm really pleased to be able to meet you all, some in person and some through this conference call. As Naveed said, my name is Hannah and I'm the new campaigns coordinator based at the Results London office. So I'm in effect the new Maddie, and will be taking on all of her different duties, such as providing support to all of the campaign groups across the UK and growing the Results network by recruiting new members and establishing groups in new locations across the UK. Thank you to the Birmingham group for kindly hosting me this evening, and I really look forward to meeting more of you in person in due course, hopefully over the next few months. I'm excited to be here at Results and have come here from different roles at Action Against Hunger, the Fair Trade Foundation and WaterAid, where I have been involved in a variety of different international development campaigns. Before that, I studied for a Master's in International Development, which has long been my main passion, focusing particularly on climate change, gender equality and nutrition. So I think that is enough about me. So I'll now go on to the monthly update from around the network in October. October was a really great month to start at Results because it was a very busy and exciting one with many different things happening across the network. As many of you will know, the 17th of October marked the 25th annual International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. To mark this occasion, Results jointly organised an advocacy day in Parliament alongside 10 other international NGOs, including Save the Children, ActionAid and Tear Fund. 11 of the 65 campaigners at the event were from Results, which is a really fantastic turnout, and 9 of our campaigners were able to meet with their MP to share with them a range of UK aid success stories, whilst also making the case for the importance of continuing UK aid in specific areas such as GP replenishment, which we'll hear some more about tonight, and nutrition. Feedback from these meetings was generally very positive, with campaigners mostly receiving positive responses and support for UK aid from their MPs. Overall, the day was really well attended with a great range of campaigners, parliamentarians and high-profile MPs, including 2 Lords and the leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, which is great. As most of you will be aware, last month's action involved writing a letter to the editor of your local newspaper. Unfortunately, not all letters were published, but some great articles were published in the Hertfordshire Mercury, the Catholic Herald and the Linlithgow Gazette. The Catholic Herald alone reaches 21,000 people, so this is all really great coverage and really great to get the message out there. 2 members of the Brighton group were also able to meet with their MP Caroline Lucas, who is the co-leader of the Green Party, to discuss nutrition for growth. She was really pleased to be approached for international development issues and agreed to take action on World Poverty Day, which is another great result. So before I pass back to Naveed, are there any other meetings or letters from around the country that anybody would like to share? Anybody?
Hello.
Hi, Jill.
We had a letter.
So was that, there's Jill and there was someone else simultaneously?
Paul.
Do you want to go first,
yes.
Paul?
Yes. Cedric, who is our brand new first result meeting ever, who came to lobbying day and had a letter published in the Bournemouth Echo.
That's great news.
No,
well,
I'll send it up.
Well done. Yeah, I'd love to see that. Thank you very much. And well done, Cedric. It was good to meet you the other day at the lobby day. That's great news. Jill, did you want to say anything?
Yes, I had an article published in Independent Catholic News as well on the same thing.
Great. I think you managed to get about three pieces, which is
pieces in.
Really,
I didn't get the one in the Metro.
Okay.
I tried for the Metro as well, and I didn't get that one.
Great, thanks. Sorry, over in Poole, did you want to say anything about the piece? Was it quite a long piece or
It's a letter.
Letter.
It's a letter. We'll send it to you.
The editor.
Letter to
Great.
the editor, yeah.
Well done.
Good, yeah.
I was wondering if anyone in Brighton wanted to say anything about their meeting with Caroline Lucas before we move on. No? Okay. Anyone else got anything they want to share? It's not compulsory. Cool. Well, thank you ever so much. Oh, who have we got there?
Hello.
Oh, hi there.
Sorry, couldn't get it off mute, but Chris is here. He went to
Hi, Naveed. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Chris.
Also, as I said, James and I went and met Caroline Lucas a few weeks ago. As you might expect, she was really on board with everything, really helpful. We spoke about nutrition mainly, but also about education. And she was really willing to get in contact with Peter Patel over the campaign, so it was really good. Brilliant news.
Thank you for that. Sounded like a really, really good meeting and a good start to a relationship with a high-profile politician. Okay, so thanks for everyone who shared what they've been up to. And thank you, Hannah, for introducing yourself and all of that activity. So I'm going to move on now to the main topic of tonight's call, which is the Global Partnership for Education. We're going to talk about why it matters. And in a minute, I'll introduce our expert speaker, who's just come on video. Hi. So before I do, I just want to take us back a couple of months, or more than that, actually. So we'd first hoped to campaign on this issue really back in April this year. And as some of you might remember, if you were around then, that as soon as we'd sent out the action materials, the UK general election was called. So we kind of couldn't campaign on that issue during the general election period. Then after the election in July, we had another go. And some of you made contact with your MP, in some cases a newly elected MP, to explain why education matters to you, why it's important for overcoming poverty, and then to write to the Secretary of State on your behalf. If you were able to take that action, thank you very much indeed. It was really important at that time to warm up MPs well ahead of GPE's replenishment, as well as to let the Secretary of State know well in advance that people would be keeping an eye on the government and setting high expectations of the UK's contribution. Back then, what we didn't know was what the conference was going to be like and when it would be, and we now do know that. The so-called financing conference, as they're calling it now, will be on the 2nd of February in Dakar in Senegal. Now, I'm not going to say any more about this now because I think it's the right time to hand over to our tonight's expert, who is Tony Baker. Welcome, Tony.
Great. Thanks so much, Naveed. Hello, everyone, and greetings from a cold, rainy day here in Washington.
Well, thank you for joining us, Tony. So I'm just going to say a few words of introduction before he says something about himself and his role. So Tony is the Associate Director for Global Education at the Results Educational Fund, which is the US version of Results. Just like Results in the UK, they work to create the public and political will to end poverty by empowering individuals to exercise their personal and political power for change. That phrase is familiar to a lot of you on the call, I hope. Tony's work includes the right to education, global education financing, and civil society engagement on education, both in the UK and abroad. Tony, can I introduce you to who we have on the call? We're joined tonight by campaigners from all around the UK, some of whom are very experienced at raising international development issues with the public, MPs and the media, as well as a few people who are newer to this kind of activity, but all of them united by a passion to take campaigning actions to make the world a better place. They have 3 pre-arranged questions for you, and we will then open it up to the floor. So for those of you on your computers, please feel free to just just pipe up. You can use the chat function, which should be on the left-hand side of your screen. So I can't see it on our screen at the moment, but I'm going to bring it up. Oh, there it is, right in the middle of the screen for us. And then if you don't want to do any of those things, you can also text in a question to me. And the number for that is 07906 662 571. That's 07906 662 571. So before we take those questions, Tony, can I ask you just to say for a couple of minutes what your story is? What is it that fires you up about your role in international development, and in particular, why education?
Yeah, great question. Happy to. I think my story, it really starts in Tanzania about 15 years ago. I went there with the U.S. Peace Corps. I was living in the northern part of the country in a village for 2 years. And it was just shortly after the time that the country had abolished school fees, made primary education free, huge influx of kids in classrooms, very little resources, very little textbooks. I think it sounds like many of you know these issues, have traveled abroad, know exactly that familiar scene of having overcrowded classrooms, overworked teachers, etc. So it was my first real engagement in the sector abroad, and since then I went on and returned to the U.S. for a while, went back to school, but eventually returned to Tanzania and worked with a domestic civil society organization called Haki Elimu, which is a kind of wordplay on Swahili right to education. And it's a very straightforward civil society accountability monitoring government engagement group, very similar to the work that we all do. But there I was really engaging the education sector, doing a lot of research on education policies and programs, a lot of accountability research on policy versus practice issues, and tracking how far programs are really being implemented. And, you know, whenever they're not, working with the government and citizens. We had a network of about 30,000 what they called Friends of Education across Tanzania that would get our materials, get our information, hold these kinds of meetings and mobilize one another to learn about what's going on in the education sector, what needs to be improved, what the shortcomings are, and take some collective action. So after that, I ended up here in the U.S. with the U.S. version of Results, which I think you can see is very much exactly a lot of what I had been doing in Tanzania, but different policy targets, different audiences, working with these multilateral institutions, working with the World Bank, providing that kind of twofold fundraising and support advocacy, but also the oversight and monitoring of those programs on the other hand. And now currently I'm leading up our global education work at Results. That entails a number of different campaign areas, and projects, but most relevant for this conversation is that I also wear a second hat, sitting on the board of directors of the Global Partnership for Education, representing the international and northern civil society constituency. So it's a fascinating space. It's one I just think is so amazing for our entire network across Results, the entire Results family in the countries that we work in, and all of our grassroots networks, that we, on the one hand, do this type of government engagement around these types of advocacy campaigns, but then we're sitting right directly in the seat of the governance mechanisms of these very organizations. So I do a lot of pretty technical policy work of ongoing engagement with the board of directors, but it's I'm quite really the beneficiary of being able to sit in both of those seats as advocate, but then really directly engage in the governance of the institutions that we are working around. So yeah, that's a little bit about me and my story.
Thanks, Tony. It's really great that you've set that out. I'm amazed by a couple of those things. I think a lot of people will be really interested to hear how we've got a seat right in the heart of this process, which should really complement the kinds of things that we can do from here. So that's really interesting, and maybe we'll delve into that a bit more later. Yep. It was really interesting also to hear about the Tanzania model, very familiar kind of model of citizen engagement, and I really like the idea of 30,000 friends of education. That's brilliant. Let's go to the first of our questions then, which is from Oxford. Oxford, are you with us still? Hopefully they're still with us.
Sorry, I was on mute.
Hi, Tiffany, do go to your question.
Okay, just a moment. My question is, sorry. Can you give us an idea of how important GPE is in helping to reach Global Goal 4, providing a quality education for all?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say very important, hugely important. GPE is really at the kind of the centerpiece of donor coordination, and really at this point, all country coordination, all government coordination to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal 4 on education. And you know, it was actually very much developed and planned in that way. Donors and governments around the world are looking at GPE as this convening space and as this kind of coordination platform for those energies put forward to develop education. And you can find this in all of these intergovernmental negotiations that happened in the lead up to establishing the Sustainable Development Goals. You have things like the Incheon Declaration that specifically calls out GPE as the platform for coordination and support towards SDG 4. You've got an Addis Ababa Action Agenda that was kind of the final outcome document of a series of meetings on how to finance the Sustainable Development Goals. And that document specifically calls for GPE to be scaled up around its investments in order to achieve SDG 4. So it's really the entire global community has put GPE as that centerpiece. If we get into the specifics of how GPE works, I think you'll quickly understand why. You know, it's this large multi-stakeholder platform of donor governments, developing country governments, aid agencies, civil society, teachers unions, really everyone around the table coordinating and developing these plans and investments and supporting countries to implement them. So hugely important. It's really kind of presented as this central coordination platform for SDG 4.
Great, thank you. I'm sure we'll come and delve into the detail of that a bit more in a minute. I think the second question, if we move over to the question which I think should be coming from Lynn Lithgow. Hello.
Hi, Tony. Our
Hi.
question from the Lithgow group is, how do we know what is the right amount of money for donors around the world to give to the GPE?
Very good question, and it's one that we as Results across all of our countries and affiliates, you know, we grapple with this every time we're working with an institution, every time there's a replenishment campaign, whenever we're deciding and working with the community on setting that ask of our donor countries. And it's a tricky one. I guess I would start with the overall landscape. We know that there's a $39 billion annual finance gap for education around the world. That's huge in relative terms. That's a gap that right now donors are not anywhere close to meeting. So in terms of the upper limit of that ask, it's extremely high. The lower limit is kind of the status quo and how much that we give right now. And I think as results advocates, it's always our task to kind of find the sweet spot between where we're at right now and what donors are doing, and that kind of ultimate finance gap and how much we'll need to get the job done. And the way that I think about it, it's you kind of want to find the, I guess it's like the magnet ask. You want something high, but if it's too far away, like a magnet, it's not going to pull that number up. So you've got to find a spot that's high, but a little bit close, and just close enough to kind of raise that bar. And so we do that a lot. And I think, with the GPE replenishment upon us, and the UK is looking at $500 million. We in the US, we have a very unique ask this time around of $337.5 million. That's because of certain appropriations processes that are already in place. But each of these are looking at, how do we go from where we are now and raise the bar a bit. It's a long process. This $39 billion finance gap, it's not going to be filled in overnight or next year. But it's part of moving in that direction. And then specifically on GPE, there was this large initiative over the last couple of years called, there was a commission on education finance that was set up to explore that very question. We have this financing gap, how are we going to fill it? And out of that, they came out with very straightforward recommendations calling for GPE to be, for investments in GPE to be $2 billion annually by 2020 and $4 billion annually by 2030. So if you look at GPE's current level of its own investments, the grants that it's giving out to developing countries around the year, it's about $500–600 million annually. So we're talking about moving GPE up from that about $500 million a year right now to $2 billion a year in 2020. And that's what they've set out in their case for investment and their replenishment target, that this $3.1 billion, their total cumulative ask, is the money that it needs to take in and give out in granting. But then there's also an additional effect of how GPE uses that money to unlock other resources or incentivize other investments in the education sector from additional sources like the World Bank, like bilateral agencies, like private sector foundations. So it's saying with that $3.1 billion over the next 3 years, it will be able to reach that $2 billion annual figure by 2020. So it's effectively set out this roadmap of how it can meet the calls of the International Finance Commission, what it has said we need donors investing in GPE by 2020. It's set up this roadmap of how to reach that by 2020. And from there, it's been a lot of work on the back end with the institution, with civil society, with ourselves, on taking that $3.1 billion figure and looking at how we will add that up across donors. So a lot of work has gone into things like the current UK ask of $500 million, essentially dividing out that total replenishment figure across all existing and prospective donors of how we're going to make up and reach that $3.1 billion.
Thanks, Tony. That's incredibly precise and comprehensive answer to that question. I hope that'll be food for thought, and maybe they'll tease out some other questions along the way. I should say that in the action materials, if people have got them, there are some links to some of the documents that give a bit more of this detail if you should need to come back to that when you're drafting your communication with MPs. So there is a link I can recall on the front page to the commission that Tony just referred to, among other things. I really like that idea of the magnet ask. You've got to be close enough to have some force, but not too far away for your ambition to be unrealisable. I really like that image. So thanks for that answer. I think that probably leads us into the third question, which is from Norwich.
Hello there, Tony. What arguments is the Global Partnership for Education using to persuade governments that it needs the $3.1 billion over the next 3 years?
Yeah, right into the brass tacks of how we get donors to make these investments. One argument, first and foremost, it's demonstration of impact. We're living in a pretty austere and conservative aid world and have been for a long time, so value for money is really at the top of everyone's agenda. GPE has to demonstrate that for the money that's going in, it's getting results, and it's getting better results than a lot of other options that donor governments have for those investments. So, and what you see there, you have a lot of those straightforward figures, like, looking at over 2015 and 16, GP's support went to help train, help distribute 42 million textbooks. I think in 2015, looking at my notes here, it supported training nearly 150,000 teachers. It built, in just the year of 2016 alone, nearly 10,000 classrooms. So that kind of clear results orientation is always necessary for a lot of the donor engagement. Secondly, and I think we'll get into really more of what the real value add of GPE is, and it does go back to this kind of convening and coordinating mechanism. GPE is by no means it's increasingly becoming one of the larger donors on the scene, but its value is more than just the money that it's giving out and supporting with grants. And it really gets into kind of the sustainable development of education systems in country. So I hope this doesn't get too wonky, but one of the main things that GP does is it works with country partners and all the other partners at the country level, and it rallies its support around an education sector plan. That's the basic kind of 5-year plan of a country to develop its complete education system. Some countries don't have that, and it's because of GPE's kind of convening power. You've got places like Somalia and the DRC that have education sector plans in place for the first time ever. So that's a huge kind of capacity building function, that supporting governments to develop those types of strong, credible plans for education development in its country in the first place. That ties into a lot of donor interest. I think from the donor side, we're all in the market of sustainability, and as USAID likes to say, working ourselves out of our jobs. We're not meant to always be in providing aid into the unknown future, but working towards sustainable independence of all countries around the world. So that's a key part of it. And I think that also speaks to the power that GPE has as a partnership that our individual donors don't have. DFID, USAID, they can't walk into a country and sit down with the government and say, okay, you're going to now develop a national plan to develop your education system. But a partnership model with all those different types of stakeholders it can do that. So that's, in terms of kind of process and really sustainability, that's a huge value add of GPE. And that is why I think a lot of donors look at GPE and supporting it. It's a way that their investments can tap into more of those long-term solutions. A very specific element of that, but I think one that really resonates with donors is the developing country government role in this. We're trying to move away from the old aid paradigm of really, top-down, north-south aid provision, but this type of partnership and helping developing country governments support and implement their own education plans. And that's often comes down to domestic resources. How much of the developing country government money that itself is committing to its education systems. And one of the requirements to access GPE funding is that a government has to be committing 20% of its national budget to education, or if it's not, demonstrate a plan ramping up to that. And working with the Ministry of Finance to develop those medium-term expenditure frameworks to reach that type of benchmark. And if it doesn't do that, then really it's not going to access GPE funds. So that's a very helpful mechanism to get that kind of increased independence of developing countries around their own development. It's also a pretty strong accountability measure that I know, the US side, they're all into the accountability right now. I think the same is true on the UK side. But it also helps to have accountability within our entire kind of aid mechanism. And, an example of that really just happened in this last year with Uganda, a pretty clear example. Uganda came and,
Tony, we lost you for a second.
Developed an education plan, developed
Tony, the signal's broken up.
Program and was requesting GPE. Any better luck?
Hang on, we lost you.
Back now.
Yeah,
Could you go back to Uganda? Could you go back to Uganda?
Okay.
Yeah.
So
thanks, Peter.
Yeah, and do pipe up if it cuts out. We've been having strange internet. The entire Comcast system in the Northeast has been struggling in the last 2 days. So Uganda came to us with a proposal asking for GP funds for this program that it had developed, but simultaneously it put in front of us plans to actually increase less of its national budget in education. So you have, it makes very little sense to be injecting aid resources while the government is decreasing its own investments in its education system. And the mechanism worked. The board said, no, we can't approve this, send it back. The government of Uganda went back to work, reconfigured its kind of outlying budgets for the next few years, and showed that it was going to increase investments in education and reach that 20% mark. So is very, very helpful, and I think a key part of some donor interest. Audible?
Yeah, you're just breaking up a little bit again there. I think we got most of that, but really good example. I think all of that came out. So, yeah, thank you ever so much for those initial questions and answers. So that's really started to get into the details of how GPE works. And we'll take as many questions as we've got time for. So we'll open up to the floor to pick Tony's brains about any aspect of how the financing of global education works, how we can explain to others just how an important part of the picture is, from funding from education from governments, institutions, and any other donors. So we'll come into that. I'll just remind you of the phone number to text again if you would like to, which is 0790 662 571. So Jill says she has a question. Do you want to go ahead, Jill?
Okay, thank you. My question is, what plans has GPE got to increase the number of children with disabilities in education, in quality, inclusive education? What GPE plans for that?
Great question. The first and foremost, GPE works to increase inclusion and equity with the education sector plans themselves, which is a holistic, systemic solution to that. So it places issues like disability, inclusion, and equity right into that planning from the beginning. Second, part of the requirements around the funding part of GPE is some results. Getting results. There's 30 depends on meeting certain criteria and progress on key issues, including equity.
You're breaking up again. Would turning off your video help, maybe?
System strengthening.
I think we lost that last bit, Tony.
So
we lost you. Could you?
Is it any better now?
That's sounding good.
No,
we haven't got you on video.
Better.
Thank you. Go back to meeting certain criteria on key issues, please.
Is the audio working out?
Yeah, we've got you loud and clear.
Okay, great. Yeah, so it sets up these benchmarks that have to be met in certain areas, and equity is one of them. And what that looks like is very specific indicators around children with disability, country specific, but we've seen several programs that put indicators around, include that benchmark, that if they meet that, then that additional 30% of those funds would be released. And then finally, GP is starting up this new type of knowledge and innovation exchange mechanism. It's starting up kind of a research and knowledge sharing platform. And this is one of the thematic areas that it will be exploring in the future. Again, I think GP's real value add is a partnership. So if it can have this type of research and knowledge, it's able to share that across all developing country governments in terms of how to improve.
Okay, you're breaking up a bit again there. We've got a whole load of questions that have just been typed into the chat box. So I'm going to try and get us through as many of those as we can. So if we maybe have slightly shorter answers, then we'll see how the time goes. So the first question came from Macclesfield. Hi, Ricky, I did get your question, sorry. I'll read the question out. Ricky's written, he's interested in the magnet amount idea, that if the amount donated is significantly less than required for SDG 4, then what do you kind of do? Do you kind of cut the scope of your ambition, or delay, or find some other way to push the amount higher? Does that question make sense to you, Tony?
One moment,
I think we might have lost our speaker.
It's amazing how good it was for most of the time.
That is true.
I was amazed it carried on when your Ethernet cable fell out.
I wasn't sure too. Yeah, it's carried on working whilst my cable fell out.
Is it? Yeah.
Must be.
Is that better?
You're sort of with us again. Did you hear the question? I think this is dropped.
Could he try linking in again?
That's a good idea. Let me write that in the chat box and see if he sees it. Oh, sorry, that's gone to Helen and Reg by mistake. I didn't send that to Tony. Tony.
Okay. All right.
Oh, you're with us.
We'll just have to. Well,
no. So near and yet so far.
Desperately trying over here.
Okay, carry on. We'll bear with you.
All right. We'll try that again. So, what was that question? I've lost my chat box.
Right, we can hear you now again. So, Ricky in Macclesfield was interested in the magnet idea that you described. But what happens if the amount donated is significantly less than what's needed for SDG 4? What do you do? Do you kind of cut the scope of your ambition, or delay, or find some other way to get more money? How does that work?
Yeah, you just got to keep on pushing on. In my book, it's not going to fill that gap immediately. And whenever we look at the current context of education, it's really not surprising. You know, we're in the middle of what people are calling a learning crisis because of the lack of resources, lack of trained teachers, etc. Really in so many developing countries around the world. That makes sense whenever you unpack and see that there's just been such low level of investment from the donor community in education year on year. So we're fighting really upstream on that, and the what works and what's needed is pretty much the work that we're doing and that all of you are doing to try to build the political will for donors to increase investment in education. It's the sector is so sorely underfunded, and we're seeing the impact of that around, you know, in classrooms around the world. So there's no immediate solution other than to just keep on with the important work that we're doing.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask you to keep your answers really short now, because I've just had a whole load of other questions texted in and come in on the chat. Edinburgh asked one some time ago, and also Brighton. So Edinburgh asks, how has 20% arrived at for the figure for countries to contribute? And then Brighton have asked, how is the 39 billion funding gap calculated? I think we might have to give, you know, relatively brief answers on those, if that's possible even. I don't know whether it is.
Yeah. Both good questions. The 20%, I haven't seen that unpacked in a long time. It's been repeated around. Boy, I don't know where that initially came from, but it is linked. It's not just GPE. It is linked to a lot of these types of, I think it's in the Incheon Declaration and several larger global compacts. The 39 billion figure on that finance gap was developed and kind of put out by UNESCO a couple of years ago, and it's been in a lot of thinking to date. I'll just pull it up and share the link that has that original UNESCO policy paper that gets into what that $39 billion or that gap is comprised of.
Okay, thanks. That's appeared in the chat. If anyone wants to copy that off the chat, you can. I don't think that will stay in the recording. So, Tony, maybe if you could, would you be able to email that to me so I've got it for anyone who wants to see it?
Yeah.
After this call, that'd be great. Right, the next question we're rattling through is from Norwich, who asked, does GPE give grants to pupils in developing countries who cannot afford to go to school? So does it work directly with pupils?
I don't off top of mind, I'm trying to recall if I've seen any programs that have what would be kind of these conditional cash transfers and to incentivize out of school children and poor families to enroll their children into school. I have not seen that. I have not seen that come through GPE. No.
Okay. Thank you. Three questions from Princess in Poole. Firstly, how is the $500 million figure derived? That's the UK figure. How are the 89 countries selected? So that's the 89 countries that GPE hopes to expand to working in. And then another question, which may be a bit more for us in the UK, what about MPs who won't sign cross-party letters? So maybe you could take the first couple of those and we can come back to the third of those.
Yeah, I'll actually also, I'll leave the $500 million figure for you all too. Like I said, it's a lot of civil society coordination with GPE Secretariat, developing that ask. There's one of the trickiest parts of all of our work is staying coordinated and ensuring that we as civil society have the same ask, that Results UK is going out with 500 million and Save the Children is as well, and Plan and others. So there's a lot of negotiation with all of those members of the education community. The 89 countries, right now GPE is in, I believe, 65 developing countries. And these are typically the lowest low-income countries. Right now, they're developing a few new types of financial products that might help it to expand and offer different types of services and products, including up to lower middle income countries. So a lot of the 89, if we're looking at the growth from the 65 countries to 89, that's about mixed on, there's some low-income countries on that, but it's a lot of expansion into lower middle-income countries, which is a good development. I don't think I need to talk about how, even though these countries might be graduating from these large categories of low-income to lower middle-income, there are a lot of equity issues, large pockets of populations that are marginalized even within a country that might be graduating due to overall increases in GDP.
Thanks, Tony. And I think if you've been sticking with some of the issues we've been talking about in recent months, and we certainly will be into next year, this idea of countries graduating out of eligibility from donor support is going to be a theme that we as Results are increasingly concerned about, not just in education, but also very much in some of the health issues that we work on. I'll try and address the 500 million figure and the what about MPs who won't sign cross-party letters. I might need to come back to you with that when I can talk to maybe one of the education experts in the UK office. But basically, the UK has been the largest donor of GPE since its inception. And we're looking at kind of roughly asking an equivalent amount to what the level of support it's given before. We want to be increasing the amount of UK aid going to education, but modestly, and think of that magnet image again. So I think when we worked out what the UK contribution had been before, with a small amount of stretch, it worked out at something like the then exchange rate of something like 492 million dollars. So whatever the UK, maybe 460 something. I can't remember his exact figure. Sorry. So that figure's been changing, of course, because of the exchange rate. GPE works in dollars. So you will actually, if you're eagle-eyed, you spot a slightly lower pound figure in this month's action materials than we put out in July. That figure's derived basically, as I say, from a previous figure, the previous contribution from the UK. On MPs who won't sign cross-party letters, if you do happen to find one, you might try asking them if they'll write their own letter. And of course, you've got the text of the cross-party letter to work on. So that's a possibility. I hope that sort of answers the question.
Sorry, Naveed. This is Bentley from Linlithgow.
Go ahead, Bentley.
I think the government and DFED has a 15% cap on the total they will give compared to everyone else donating to the GPE.
That's exactly right, yes. And that puts an upper limit on it.
Problem? Is that an issue? What?
Yeah, this is again one of those judgment calls, so that's exactly right. And that's one of the things that sets the upper limit of that stretch that we were talking about. So we don't exactly know, but we think it's likely that they would want to apply a cap approach again to this year's UK contribution. So it's kind of working on that trying to be ballpark and not too ambitious, so that we're not, we're someone that they feel they can talk to, but recognizing that they are going to put limits such as that cap. There may be those having to unlock match funding again. We just simply don't know at this stage. It's a bit too early. DFID are obviously playing it pretty close to the chest. But thank you for reminding us of the 15%.
Okay, cheers.
So there's a comment here from Birmingham, which is not a question but a comment. And it's a really good point, actually, that when those people who were at the international conference in Washington back in July, they actually, some of the members lobbied the House Representatives and Senate to support GPE as well. So it might be an idea to possibly tell MPs here that we're working alongside colleagues in the US and in other countries who are all trying to secure good contributions working in partnership. So that might kind of counteract comments about why the UK should be the ones to give. That's quite a useful argument for some of those MPs who might think we're maybe pulling too much weight. So I have a question here, which I think is one that will go back to Tony probably. We've just got a few minutes left, so apologies if we don't get to everything. Deirdre in Paul's texted in, how about funding of all those children in camps who are not nationals of host countries? Whose plan are they in?
Yeah, I'll say just quickly on a couple of points before that. I did a quick look, and I did find that there are some cases of plans including cash transfers to students, particularly girls. I just put a link into the chat box there, and we can also email that around. Not sure of the country specifics, but it does look like it's something that does come up into plans. And yes, on the U.S. front, and looking at what the U.S., what the Senate and House are doing for education, even though, despite the climate that we're in the middle of here in the U.S., amazingly, a few months ago, there was the passage of the Reinforcing Education Accountability in Development Act, or READ Act, that results U.S. has been working on for 13 years. And actually, even though the current political climate, this was something that we had done so much work on and built so much political will around, that it even passed now. And it's a real statement of that type of Senate and House support to education, including the Global Partnership for Education. On refugee education, it is part of the host country education plans. We're seeing there's increasing cases of this that's coming forward from GPE planning. And I think it also relates to one of the first questions on how is GPE marketing itself, advertising itself? And I think it's very timely to look at issues of immigration and the refugee population. There was some information that came out last year in regards to Syria that in addition to food insecurity, violence, the bombing, but what was being seen as the #1 reason for mass migration was educational opportunities. And I think that this is a real talking point with GPE in our donor context as we're looking at what to do with the refugee crisis. And it's a key part that GPE is looking at. And yes, it does a lot of refugee and internally displaced persons do get support through those plans and programs.
That's great, thank you. We've actually just run out of time, and we have covered all the questions, with one exception, which is from Paul. I think I might have seen Emily writing this, but whoever it was, if we're writing to MPs, should we mention Priti Patel or just the Secretary of State? I think the answer probably is it doesn't matter. The MP will know who it is, but whatever language you want to use, I think that doesn't matter at all. So that's all of the questions that we've had. We've run out of time. Thank you so much, Tony. I've personally learned a huge amount from this evening. before we just completely end the call, if you could bear with me for just about a minute and a half, there's a couple of other opportunities this month, in addition to the main action of contacting your MP to ideally get them to sign on to this joint parliamentary sign-on letter. One, again, we're indebted to Results in the UK, that they've organised a webinar on Saturday at 7 p.m, that's Saturday at 7 p.m. our time, UK time, with the chair of GPE, Julia Gillard, the former Prime Minister of Australia. Now, that's only going to be a short call, some sort of 30, 35 minutes. So in addition to the opportunity to hear from someone who's actually on the board of GPE, we actually get the chance to hear from the chair as well. So that's pretty awesome, I think. So if they can join us for that, please do. If anyone would like to try and submit a question to Julia Gillard, please email me. May well not be able to get a question in this time available, but we can try. But they would love to have at least one question from all of the countries who are going to be joining us, which is the US, UK, Canada, and Australia. I think it's going to be about 2 in the morning for the Australians. Between our 4 countries, we provide about 40% of the funding to GPE, so it's really, really important that we're seen to be acting together. So that's a great opportunity. Also, if you've got time this month, another thing that some groups might want to do is think about a letter writing meeting. I know that some of the people joining this call tonight have talked about that with me one-to-one. One of the supporting materials this month is a kind of action sheet on how to run a meeting, on getting people to actually take those advocacy actions if you've not done that before, if people are meeting to do that for the first time. So there's a script there which is good to go, and if any of you want to use that or feedback on whether that's useful, that will be really helpful to us. Then lastly, or nearly lastly, sorry, social media. GPE is running a campaign called Shape the Future, and they really, really want support for that. So the hashtags that are being used are hashtag Shape the Future and hashtag Fund Education. I think all around the Results family, we've been talking about, in coordination meetings, talking about really stepping up to support that. If you go to the GPE website, and again, there are links on the action materials, there's a whole load of graphics, some really nice video materials, all sorts of stuff to help you if you want to put a social media campaign together. Not just around this action, but really from now right up until February. And we also have our own contribution now on the Results UK website. We have an e-action for people who are new to campaigning, maybe just want to take a simple action on a website and maybe not actually write their own, contact an MP so personally. And then very lastly, as some of you also know, a sister campaign, almost you could put it, that is called Send My Friend. So teachers and schools working together to support GPE this year. That is run by the Global Campaign for Education UK, which, as some of you know, is hosted in this office by Results. So if you know any teachers, you can pick up resources for them to get involved there's again a link on the action materials. So that's a huge amount of stuff. We've covered a lot of ground. Massive thanks to Tony for being with us, and to everybody for giving up a part of their evenings. So I'm going to sign off now. As always, please do keep us updated on the actions you're taking. Thank you very much for all that you're doing, and enjoy the rest of your evenings.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Naveed.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks. Bye.
Naveed, it's Mark here in Norwich. How you doing? All right?